June 10, 1944, Utah Beach. The surf is still crowded with wreckage when Second Lieutenant Eleanor Harper, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, steps off the ramp and realizes there is no hospital waiting, only mud, canvas, and an endless road of wounded. Within days, the push towards St. Lo turns her field tents into a choking bottleneck, where minutes decide who lives long enough to reach a surgeon. Blood must be kept cold without walls. Paper tags become lifelines. And when Operation Cobra detonates the front, the casualty surge forces Eleanor and her team to invent a brutal new discipline, speed surgery without mistakes. In Normandy, saving lives becomes a battle of logistics, triage, and nerve. So let's go there now. Utah Beach, D+4. The first ward is the ground. June 10, 1944. Utah Beach, Normandy, France. The sea is not loud in the way she expected. Not a grand roar. It's a constant, indifferent shove against metal and sand, water slapping a landing craft ramp, water dragging at boots, water working its way into seams that were never meant to be tested like this. Above it all, engines, shouted commands, the hollow clank of gear, and, far inland, the dull concussion of artillery that doesn't stop long enough to count. Second Lieutenant Eleanor Harper steps down into the shallows with her helmet strap biting her chin, a musette bag high against her ribs so the contents won't soak through. The Red Cross brassard on her upper arm feels like a spotlight. She's been told it is protection. She's also been told, quietly, that nothing here is protection. She isn't alone. There are other nurses, faces tight with concentration, hands occupied with what hands can do when a mind wants to run ahead. They move behind medics and enlisted men hauling litters, behind officers peering toward the dunes and the road exits, behind the steady forward pull of the invasion machine. It takes only minutes for the first reality to hit. There is no building waiting for them. No white corridor. No calm receiving desk. The hospital is wherever the army decides to throw down canvas and call it a ward. A captain in the medical corps waves them off the beach, voice hoarse from repeating the same instructions to everyone who needs them most. Field hospital elements are inland. Keep moving. Stay off the open road. Follow the markers. Red Cross signs. Don't bunch up. Red Cross signs, simple boards, arrows, painted fast. They look fragile against the scale of everything else. The traffic, the equipment, the men moving like ants with steel and bandages. Eleanor's training was precise. Ward management, sterile technique, anesthesia observation, shock recognition. She passed exams that asked the right questions in the right order. Normandy does not care about order. A jeep clatters past with a medic in the passenger seat holding a casualty's wrist like he's trying to will the pulse to behave. Another vehicle, an ambulance, already streaked with mud, stops long enough for the driver to shout, "Where's your unit? They're stacking them up at the collecting point." Stacking, as if men were crates. Her boots find firmer ground beyond the beach exits, in crushed hedgerow and churned soil. A smell of smoke and wet vegetation hangs low. Somewhere a fighter passes with a ripping snarl. Everyone flinches without meaning to. The first receiving area is a shallow depression near a line of trees, barely concealed. It isn't the hospital yet, more like a handoff point. Litter bearers arrive in pairs, shoulders hunched, carrying men whose faces are the colour of wax. A sergeant with a clipboard and a stack of tags calls out short orders. "Tag 'em! Morphine time on the card, don't lose the card." Eleanor kneels beside a soldier whose eyes are open but not seeing. The medic beside him fumbles for the small paper tag, field medical card, tied to a buttonhole. Eleanor's fingers steady the tag long enough to read the scrawl. Injury, treatment, time. This is the first language of the system, pencil marks that decide what happens next. "Ma'am," the medic says, as if apologizing for the scene, "they told us you'd be here." As if her presence is a promised supply item. She looks up and sees what the inland road is becoming, a moving pipeline of damage. A few men walking, guided by buddies, some on stretchers, some already quiet under blankets, and the wave behind them, unseen yet, but approaching. A lieutenant with a map case jogs over, rain speckled though the sky isn't raining. His face is young enough that Eleanor thinks for a second he could have been one of her students back at the stateside training hospital. "Second platoon is setting up," he says. "Tents going up now. You're surgical? They want nurses in shock and pre-op. We need you moving." Shock and pre-op, not ward, not surgery suite, just functions. The map is being redrawn into verbs. They reach the first tent line after a short, fast march. Canvas rises and falls like breath. Men pound stakes. Someone drags a coil of hose through mud. A generator coughs, then catches, and lights flicker weakly under canvas as if embarrassed to be there. Inside one tent, cots are arranged in rows too tight for comfort. A pot-bellied stove sits unused, waiting for fuel. Basins, folded blankets, boxes marked with medical supply stencils, some soaked, some intact. A major in a muddy field jacket points at Eleanor without ceremony. "Lieutenant, your shock ward. You'll take the worst ones first. Warm them, start plasma when ordered, watch their breathing, keep the tags and times straight. We're going to turn this place into a machine. You understand?" Eleanor does not answer with emotion. She answers like an officer. "Yes, sir." The major's mouth tightens, just for a moment, recognition that she understands too well what machine means here. Outside, the rumble of distant guns continues. Somewhere, an officer shouts for more litters. The canvas walls flutter with each gust. Eleanor sets her bag down and rolls up her sleeves. She checks the first box of supplies: glass bottles, rubber tubing, needles, bandage rolls. The instruments of saving, fragile and finite. A line forms at the entrance. The first wave is here. The first surge. Tags, times, and the rules of triage. The receiving tent becomes a mouth. It opens and it does not close. By late afternoon, the ground outside is a churned lane of footprints and stretcher tracks. Ambulances arrive, reverse, unload, pull out, replaced immediately by another. Enlisted men, some trained medics, some simply assigned bodies, move casualties in a practiced rhythm that is already changing. Less careful now, more urgent, because the next load is always seconds away. Eleanor stands at the edge of the shock area, where the worst cases are placed first, and learns that the first rule of Normandy medicine is not a medical rule. It's an arithmetic rule. Space, time, supplies, how many cots, how many bottles, how many hands. The second rule follows close behind. Do not let the paper disappear. A casualty is carried in, helmet still on, chin strap dangling, his uniform darkened with mud and rain and something else Eleanor refuses to name in detail. His breathing is quick, shallow. His skin is cool under her fingers when she takes his wrist. "Tag?" she asks. A medic thrusts it toward her. The string is wet. The pencil marks have smudged, but she can still make out the morphine time and a terse diagnosis. The time matters. It always matters. Too much morphine, too soon, and a man's breathing can fail. Too little, and he will thrash and tear at dressings and tubing. Eleanor slides the tag under a rubber band on the foot of the cot, a small act of organisation against the tide. "Warm him," she says, already turning to the next. Blankets are scarce. They improvise with whatever is dry. Someone brings hot water in a canteen cup and pours it into a rubber bottle that looks like it belongs in a nursery. Eleanor presses it into the crook of an elbow, where blood still flows. A doctor leans in. Quick assessment with eyes and hands. "Plasma," he orders. "Start it. Slow. Plasma first. Dried or bottled, reconstituted, a precious substitute for the blood they can't always deliver forward in time." Eleanor threads tubing, checks for air, watches the drip chamber. She keeps her voice even, because panic is contagious in a tent full of men fighting for breath. Outside, the receiving line grows longer. The triage officer, sleeves rolled, helmet pushed back, moves from stretcher to stretcher, making decisions that sound like cruelty if you don't understand the math. This one to surgery, now. Hold him, stabilize. Walking wounded to the side, bandage and move. Mark him for evacuation as soon as he can travel. Eleanor hears a phrase repeated by the senior nurses, not as cynicism but as instruction. Treat the ones you can return to the line, and the ones you can save with what you have. She does not like it. She learns it anyway. Night comes without darkness at first. The sky remains bruised with distant gun flashes. The generator lights under canvas pull insects in swarms. They throw nets when they can, swat when they can't. Sterility becomes a constant negotiation. Hands washed in cold water, instruments boiled or autoclaved when fuel allows, gauze protected like currency. A corporal brings a crate of bandages and looks at Eleanor with an exhausted grin. "Ma'am, they said you nurses were coming, thought it was a rumour." She does not answer him with humour. She takes the crate and starts distributing. As hours pass, the tent begins to develop stations, an unplanned architecture of function. Receiving, sorting, shock, pre-op, post-op, evacuation staging. The labels change depending on who says them, but the shape is the same, a pipeline, pushing men from one handoff to the next. Eleanor's station is shock and pre-op, the narrowest part of the bottleneck. The surgeons can only cut so fast, the anaesthetists can only put so many men under. The tables are limited, the lights are weak, the air under canvas is wet and heavy with the smell of disinfectant and sweat. The Major returns just after midnight, stepping around a puddle that has formed where the canvas sags. "How many through surgery?" he asks. Eleanor glances at the board, chalk marks, names, times. 21 since dusk, she reports. The Major exhales through his nose, not satisfaction, calculation. "We'll double it," he says, and then softer, "We have to." That is the moment Eleanor understands what the coming weeks will demand. Not simply skill, not simply courage, but an invention, making speed safe enough, making haste precise enough, because the surge will not wait for perfection. In the corner, a soldier murmurs a name over and over, eyes closed. Eleanor adjusts his blanket and checks the drip. She looks at her watch, writes the time on the tag with a pencil nub. In Normandy, salvation is scheduled in minutes. The shock ward hardens, heat, plasma, blood, repeat. 2 days later, Eleanor no longer measures time by sunrise. She measures it by convoys. A lull is never peace. It's an intake held up on the road, or a shift in the fighting, or simply the moment before the next wave arrives. The staff learns to eat standing. They learn to sleep in fragments. 15 minutes on a cot, boots on, helmet within reach. Someone digs slit trenches near the tents, because even the Red Cross markings don't guarantee safety. Eleanor watches enlisted men shovel in silence, and she digs too, because rank does not stop shell fragments. By mid-June, the hospital elements have pushed inland enough that the sounds change. Less surf, more artillery. The ground becomes hedgerow country. Tight lanes, wet banks, fields carved into compartments by earth and thorn. It's beautiful in a way that feels like betrayal. The casualties come in looking like the terrain, scratched, soaked, and exhausted beyond what Eleanor saw in training wards. Many are not dramatic. They are quiet. That's what frightens her. Quiet men with pale lips and hands that feel too cold. The physicians begin to speak of shock the way engineers speak of pressure. The body is a system. It can fail all at once, or it can fail by degrees. Their job is to prevent collapse long enough for surgery, long enough for evacuation. Eleanor becomes the constant pair of hands in that doctrine. Warm, elevate, start plasma or blood when ordered, monitor pulse and respiration. Write down every time. A new routine forms, and with it a new language. Pre-op needs 2. Post-op is full, move anyone stable. Shock is stacking, get more blankets. We're out of clean sheets, use what you have. What they have is never enough, so they become skilled at substitutions. For warmth, stoves when fuel arrives, hot water bottles when it doesn't, layers of wool blankets borrowed from wherever they can be spared. For light, generator bulbs and flashlights with taped lenses. For order, clipboards, chalkboards, paper tags, and the discipline to never assume you'll remember without writing. Then the blood problem sharpens. Plasma is helpful, but it is not everything. The surgeons and physicians talk in low voices about men who look better after plasma, blood pressure up, pulse steadier, only to fade again. Experience is teaching them that volume alone isn't the whole answer. They need red cells. They need true replacement. One evening, a truck arrives with a medical officer riding in the back, guarding the cargo like a paymaster. "Whole blood," he says as the rear doors swing open. "Handle it right. Keep it cold." Inside are insulated containers and bottles that must remain refrigerated. Eleanor sees the ice and immediately thinks of the logistics that made it possible. Donors, storage, transport, coordination. A system behind the system. The doctor in charge of shock nods once, as if accepting a weapon. "We'll use it on the worst," he says, "and we'll track results. Every bottle." Eleanor learns to manage the cold chain with the same seriousness she manages sterility. Blood cannot be left in the heat under canvas. It must be kept cold, protected from the sun, guarded from being wasted through carelessness. She assigns an enlisted man to watch the containers as if they are ammunition, because in a way they are. As surgical teams rotate through exhaustion, help arrives in the form of attached specialists. Teams of surgeons and anaesthetists moved forward to reinforce when casualty flows spike. Their presence changes the tempo. The operating tent becomes more than a single table and a desperate set of hands. It becomes a line. Eleanor sees the first glimpse of what will become speed surgery, not as recklessness but as choreography. A patient is moved into pre-op while another is still under the knife. A nurse shaves and preps skin quickly, precisely. Instruments are laid out in standard sets. Anaesthetists work in tight rhythm: induction, maintenance, handoff. Post-op receives before the surgeon even looks up. The goal is not to hurry the cutting. The goal is to eliminate wasted seconds between the cutting. Eleanor is pulled into the operating tent one night when a nurse collapses from fatigue. "Circulate," the head nurse orders. You know the drill. Eleanor takes her place beside the instrument table, checks sterile packs, calls out counts, retrieves supplies before the surgeon asks twice. She hears the clipped language of the surgeons, diagnosis and plan reduced to essentials. Debride, control bleeding, stabilize, move. No speeches, no drama, just work. Outside, the triage line continues. The hospital is now fully a machine, receiving, sorting, resuscitating, cutting, recovering, evacuating, each link strained, each link necessary. In the early hours, Eleanor steps out of the operating tent and realizes her hands are cramped from gripping forceps and clamps. She flexes her fingers and looks toward the dark hedgerows beyond the lights. Somewhere out there, men are being wounded at the same pace as the staff is saving them. The major passes her and mutters, not unkindly, "You'll get used to it." Eleanor thinks, "No, I'll get functional." And that, she suspects, is what the army is really asking of all of them. Sterility under canvas, turning chaos into a process. Rain becomes a character in Normandy. It arrives without drama, settles in like an occupying force and refuses to leave. The canvas walls sweat. Mud creeps under tent flaps. Boots never fully dry. Bandage rolls must be guarded in crates and wrapped in oilcloth, yet somehow damp finds its way in anyway. Eleanor's shock ward is now a narrow corridor of decisions. The staff has learned that you cannot treat every man as if you have all night. You do not have all night. You have the time between ambulance arrivals. The senior nurse, First Lieutenant McKinnon, older, sharper, unafraid to correct doctors when needed, develops rules that sound like sternness until you see how many lives they preserve. Never leave a tag floating. Never hang an IV without a time. Never assume the last nurse did it. Never let anyone talk you into skipping the count. Counts matter. Sponges, instruments, needles. It is the one place where speed must bow to certainty. Eleanor watches the operating section reorganize itself. The surgeons and anaesthetists demand standardization, not for comfort but for tempo. A tray is a tray. A clamp is in the same place every time. Gauze is folded the same way. Sterile packs are stacked in order of likely need. To a civilian eye, it would look obsessive. To Eleanor, it looks like the only way to keep from drowning. The invented part of speed surgery appears in small choices. Instead of one operating table used until the staff collapses, they create rotation. As one patient is being closed, another is already prepped in pre-op. The anaesthetist moves like a switch operator, transferring attention from one set of vitals to another. A corporal in charge of sterilization rigs a system with 2 boiling units when fuel allows, one for instruments, one for basins and tubing. When fuel doesn't allow, they prioritize, cutting instruments first, everything else second. The smell of disinfectant is constant, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Eleanor is assigned for a full day to flow. It's a new duty invented by necessity. She stands between receiving and shock and pre-op and directs bodies the way a rail yard master directs cars. 2 to shock, now. That one to pre-op. Tag says no morphine since morning. Walking wounded to the side, get them dressed and moved. Post-op needs cots, clear space. You watching might think it is cold, but the coldness is in the enemy shells and the hedgerow mines and the metal that tears into flesh. Eleanor's voice is not cold, it is controlled. Control is kindness when the world is chaos. A new problem appears by late June: infection. They have sulfur drugs and they have penicillin in limited quantities, but neither is magic. Dirt and cloth and delay are powerful enemies. The surgeons emphasize debridement, cleaning wounds thoroughly, removing dead tissue, giving the body a chance to fight. It is painstaking work done at speed, which is a contradiction Eleanor learns to live inside. One afternoon, a surgeon snaps at a young medic who reaches over a sterile field. "Do you want to kill him after I save him?" he barks. The medic recoils, humiliated. Eleanor steps in with the tone she uses when a ward orderly panics back home. Hands down. Step back. Watch. You'll get another job in a second. The medic nods and moves away, grateful for instructions he can follow. This is what nursing becomes in Normandy. Not only care, but stabilization of the entire human machine. Late at night, Eleanor meets a chaplain in the corridor between tents. He is carrying cigarettes and small paper cups of coffee that taste like burnt metal. "You look like you're walking in your sleep, Lieutenant," he says. Eleanor accepts the coffee, keeps moving. "If I stop, I'll fall down." The chaplain watches her for a moment. "Write a letter," he suggests, "even if you don't send it." Eleanor almost laughs at the idea, time for letters, as if time is something that belongs to her. But later, in a brief lull, she takes a scrap of paper and writes down a list instead of a message. Bandages, blankets, more needles, more plasma, more blood, more hands. She realizes the list is a prayer in logistics. The lull ends when an ambulance arrives at speed, the driver sliding in the mud. The back doors open and the smell of wet wool and antiseptic pours out. A medic jumps down. "Mass incoming," he shouts. "They hit a hedgerow line. It's bad." Eleanor crushes the paper in her fist, tosses it into her pocket, and moves to the receiving point. The machine must run again. Above them, the rain continues, indifferent. Towards Saint-Lô, the bottleneck tightens. Early July 1944, hedgerow country approaches to Saint-Lô. The fighting moves in slow motion on the map and in violent bursts on the road. For Eleanor's hospital, the approach to Saint-Lô is not a single battle but a grinding accumulation, day after day of shattered units sent back in pieces. The hedgerows are close-range killing grounds, and the casualties reflect it. More fragments, more concussions, more men whose eyes are too wide because they heard the blast before they felt it. The hospital shifts position to remain useful. Not too far forward, tents are vulnerable, staff irreplaceable. Not too far back, delay kills. The move is a controlled scramble. Canvas rolled, cots stacked, sterilizers loaded, blood containers guarded like treasure. Eleanor rides in the back of a truck with medical crates between her knees, helmet low, watching the Normandy lane slide past. Sunken roads bordered by high earth banks, trees dripping with rain. She sees civilians at a distance sometimes, silhouettes in doorways, people who do not wave and do not stare too long. War has taught them caution. When the hospital reopens in the new site, the first ambulances arrive before the last tent is fully staked. The triage officer, now a familiar figure with a voice that carries, points to a patch of ground and says, "Receiving there, shock here, pre-op near the generator, post-op to the left." It is a crude sketch of a hospital drawn on mud. Eleanor's shock ward becomes the hardest working square of canvas in the line. She sees patterns now. She recognizes the pale, damp skin of shock. She recognizes the restless hands of a man who is losing his grip on pain. She recognizes the too calm voice that can mean a soldier is about to collapse. She begins to anticipate needs before they're spoken. Warm blankets ready, tubing pre-cut, needles lined up, tags and pencils always within reach. This is not because she has become fearless. It is because fear wastes time. Saint-Lô becomes a word spoken in fragments. Officers mention it with a glance at maps. Drivers mention it with a curse. Wounded men mention it with a blank stare, as if the name itself is a doorway they can't walk through again. One afternoon, a sergeant from an infantry unit, mud up to his knees, stops Eleanor near receiving. "Mum," he says, "you got room?" Eleanor looks past him at the cots. The answer is always no. She gives the answer that still does something. "We'll make room," she says. He nods, relieved not by space but by certainty. Then he adds, almost as an afterthought, "They're saying Cobra's coming." Eleanor doesn't know the operational details. She knows the tone. When men speak of an offensive with a mix of dread and hope, it means the casualty curve will spike. The surgeons begin preparing as if they can prepare for a storm. They inventory instruments. They request more blood. They ask for additional surgical teams. They rearrange the operating tent into stations with clearer flow. Scrub area, table 1, table 2, recovery. Eleanor watches the head nurse tape a simple sign to a tent pole. Keep moving. It is not motivational. It is mechanical. It is the only way the system survives. On the day Saint-Lô is finally taken, news filtering in as a rumour first, then confirmed by an officer with a tired grin, the hospital does not celebrate. The capture does not end the wounded. It changes the direction of traffic. That night, ambulances arrive with men from the outskirts and the ruined roads leading into the city. The air smells faintly of smoke, even at the hospital site. The chaplain moves among the cots, offering water and cigarettes, saying prayers that are quiet enough not to disturb the living. Eleanor, moving from cot to cot, hears a wounded corporal whisper, "Is it ours? Saint-Lô?" she asks. He nods, eyes glazed. "Yes," Eleanor says, "it's ours." The corporal exhales as if giving up weight he has been carrying since June. Then a medic appears at Eleanor's shoulder. "More incoming," he says. "They say tomorrow's going to be big." Eleanor looks at her watch. She writes the time on a tag. She checks a plasma bottle's drip rate. She looks toward the operating tent, where the surgeons are already gloved, already bent over a table. The machine is running at the edge of its limits. Tomorrow it will be asked to exceed them. Operation Cobra, the day speed becomes doctrine. July 25th, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. Morning arrives as vibration. Not birds, not church bells. Aircraft. The sound builds from a distant hum into a heavy layered thunder that makes the tent poles tremble. Eleanor steps outside shock ward and looks up. The sky is filled with movement. Waves of bombers at high altitude, so many that they seem to stitch the clouds into patterns. Around her, enlisted men pause mid-task. A surgeon steps out of the operating tent, squinting upward, jaw clenched. "Cobra," someone says, as if naming a storm gives it form. Then the bombing hits farther south and west, beyond Eleanor's line of sight. The ground does not shake like an earthquake. It shudders in repeated blows, a distant pounding that you feel through boots and ribs. The air seems to thicken. Even the hedgerows look smaller under the scale of it. Eleanor has no time to watch. Within an hour, the first ambulance arrives too fast, fishtailing in mud. The driver doesn't even shut off the engine. "Stack 'em!" a medic yells. "We got 100 more behind us." And the surge begins. Receiving becomes a rapid-fire exchange. Litter bearers run, clerks scribble. The triage officer's voice turns into a metronome. "Immediate, immediate, hold, walking wounded, move them out." Eleanor is at flow again, because flow is the only way the tent city does not become a pile. A young private is carried in, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly. His tag is already filled. Morphine time written in hard pencil, diagnosis in shorthand. Eleanor reads the words and sees the urgency. "Shock," she orders, and the litter turns toward her ward. Another casualty arrives, conscious, insisting he can walk, blood staining his sleeve. Eleanor catches his elbow. "Sit," she says. "You sit because I said so." He sits, then sags, and she realizes he was standing on stubbornness alone. By midday, the operating tent is no longer a room. It is a conveyor. 2 tables now run in parallel. One surgeon works while the next team scrubs. An anaesthetist moves between head-of-table positions, checking masks, watching chest rise, adjusting oxygen flow. Nurses circulate like gears. Instrument counts, suture packs, gauze, suction, saline, penicillin for those judged to need it most. Eleanor is pulled into the operating section again, not because they want her there, but because the system demands every trained set of hands. Lieutenant Harper, the head nurse, snaps, "You're pre-op lead. Make it fast. Make it clean. Don't cut corners that kill." Eleanor nods once and becomes the centre of a new invention. Speed with rules. She organises pre-op into stations with the help of 2 medics and a WAC clerk pressed into service. It is not a perfect team, but it is a team. Station 1, tag check, morphine time, allergy or reaction noted if known. Station 2, clothing cut away, wound exposed, gross dirt removed. Station 3, skin prep, hair clipped if necessary, sterile drape staged. Station 4, IV started, plasma or blood begun if ordered, temperature supported. They work in rhythm. Eleanor calls out times. The clerk writes them down. The medics move litters. Patients flow towards surgery not as individuals first, but as urgent problems needing specific solutions. The triage officer steps into pre-op and points at 3 litters in succession. "These 3, now," he says. Eleanor looks and sees why. Men whose breathing is compromised, whose skin is ashen, whose injuries will not tolerate delay. She signals for blood on one, plasma on another, oxygen on the third. A surgeon passes behind her and mutters, "Good." The word is not praise. It is confirmation that the system is holding, barely. Then the worst part of the day, the bottleneck hits. Operating tables are full, post-op is full, shock is full, and ambulances keep arriving. Eleanor feels the pressure in her chest, the instinct to panic. She forces it down. She finds the head nurse. "We need more space," Eleanor says. The head nurse's eyes flick to the only available ground. Outside, under a tarp line, exposed to weather, but still space. "Open overflow," the head nurse orders. "Blankets and cots, whatever we have." Overflow becomes another ward, created in minutes. Eleanor moves men there whose vitals are stable enough to wait, freeing cots for those fading. It feels like juggling glass. A young lieutenant from an infantry unit grips Eleanor's sleeve as she passes. "Don't let me die here," he says, voice cracking on the last word. Eleanor leans close, speaking with the authority of someone who cannot afford false promises. "Keep breathing," she tells him. "You do that, and we'll do the rest." As evening approaches, the bombing's echo fades, replaced again by artillery and small arms. The hospital's tempo does not fade, it accelerates. Night is when they do their hardest work, because the pipeline of casualties arrives late and because darkness conceals movement, both theirs and the enemy's. Under dim lights, the invented doctrine becomes real. Reduce every non-essential minute. No wandering for supplies, standard packs staged. No debates at the table, triage already decided. No idle waiting, next patient prepped while this one closes. No lost paperwork, tags secured, times recorded, decisions traceable. Eleanor sees it clearly now. Speed surgery is not a single technique. It is an entire ecosystem built under canvas because the surge made anything else impossible. Near midnight, Eleanor's hands shake as she ties a dressing. She braces her wrists on the cot frame until the tremor passes. A medic offers her water. "You okay, ma'am?" Eleanor takes the canteen, swallows, and returns it. "I'm functioning," she says. Outside, the ambulance engines continue. Cobra has broken something on the front. In the hospital, Cobra has forced an invention that will not be unmade. The night is far from over, the blood run keeping life cold in a hot war. The problem with saving lives is that it creates another problem, what the body needs next. By the second night of Cobra's surge, Eleanor's shock ward is crowded with men who have survived the first critical hours, but are balanced on a narrow edge. Still cold, still weak, still dependent on fluids and blood and warmth. The doctors do not speak in poetry, they speak in requirements. More blood, more plasma, keep them warm, watch for collapse. Blood becomes the limiting factor again. Around 200 hours, a runner appears at the shock tent entrance, breathless, helmet askew. "Lieutenant, blood shipment just came in. They need you at storage." Eleanor follows him to a small tent set aside for refrigeration. Generator fed, crowded with insulated containers and whatever cooling equipment they can maintain in field conditions. An officer stands there with a clipboard, face drawn. "We got enough for tonight," he says, "if it stays cold." Eleanor opens one container and feels the chill. Ice packs, bottles arranged carefully, labels intact. She thinks of the chain that brought them here. Collection, storage, transport, coordination. It feels miraculous and also frighteningly fragile. A sergeant points at the generator. "It's running hot," he says. "We lose that, we lose the lot." Eleanor does not outrank physics, but she can impose procedure. "Rotate the containers," she orders. "Keep lids closed. Only open when you draw. Assign a man to watch the generator and fuel. No one walks off." The sergeant nods, relieved to have orders that can be obeyed. Back in shock, Eleanor begins hanging blood under the physician's supervision, watching the drip with intense focus. The liquid looks almost black in the low light, a dense promise moving down clear tubing. A patient's pulse steadies under her fingers. His skin warms slightly. His eyes, half-lidded, flutter open. "Where am I?" he whispers. "Hospital," Eleanor answers. "You're safe for now." For now. It is the most honest phrase she knows. The night deepens. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, artillery continues. The hospital is not directly shelled, but stray rounds are always possible, and aircraft still appear overhead. When a distant explosion sounds closer than it should, Eleanor feels every staff member stiffen at once. Then an air raid warning, short, urgent, crackles from a field phone line near HQ tents. Not a full siren, but enough to change posture. "Lights down," someone shouts. "Kill the generator lights in the open tents." Darkness in a hospital is not simple. You can't stop care, you can only conceal it. Eleanor instructs her medics to use flashlights with taped lenses. She covers glowing equipment with blankets. She keeps the drips running, counting drops by feel and habit. You, watching, might imagine that this is the moment fear takes over. It does not. The staff has crossed that line already. Fear is now a background noise, like the guns. The foreground is always the man whose breathing changes. A surgeon appears at Eleanor's tent entrance, his gloves blood-stained, his eyes hard with fatigue. "How's shock?" he asks. "Stable where we can stabilize," Eleanor says. "We're using blood on the worst, plasma on the rest." The surgeon nods, then glances toward the dark road where ambulances still arrive with dimmed lights. "They're still coming," he says almost to himself. "Yes," Eleanor answers. A young nurse, newer than Eleanor, still carrying that stateside softness around the eyes, sways slightly near the supply table. Eleanor catches her elbow. "Sit," Eleanor orders. 2 minutes. "I can't," the nurse whispers. They need you conscious," Eleanor says, sharper than she intends. Then softer. 2 minutes, drink water. The nurse sits on an ammo crate, head in hands. Eleanor turns away before sympathy becomes paralysis. At dawn, the rain returns. It drizzles through seams. Mud thickens. The hospital smells like wet canvas and antiseptic and exhaustion. Cobra's casualties ease slightly as front lines shift, but the delayed flow keeps coming. Men who lay in ditches for hours, men dragged out of fields at dusk, men whose units broke through and left behind pockets of wounded. Eleanor's documentation board is filled with names and times. Some names are crossed out, evacuated onward. Some remain, still critical. A few have a mark Eleanor refuses to dwell on. A major approaches with a new directive. We jump forward soon. Prepare to move elements. Move, again. Eleanor looks at the shock ward. Half-stabilized men, drips hanging, blankets layered. Moving them will be risky. Not moving will be worse, because the Army's medical system must follow the fight. She nods once. "We'll package them," she says. "Tags secure. Drips managed. Blanket wraps tight." This, too, is part of speed medicine, not just cutting quickly, but moving quickly, making the wounded portable as soon as possible because the war does not pause for recovery. As the day brightens, Eleanor watches an ambulance depart loaded with men whose eyes track the tent poles as if memorizing them. She knows the next stop might be a beach evacuation point, or a hospital ship, or a transport plane. She knows the system is vast. Standing there in the mud, she realizes something else. The hospital has become a kind of invention factory, not for glory but for survival, and it will keep inventing until the surge finally breaks. Throughput, from tent to beach to sky. By early August, Eleanor can trace the evacuation chain in her sleep. She can see it as a map in motion. Battalion aid stations close to the line, medics and surgeons working under fire. Collecting points, sorting, tagging, pushing casualties backward. Clearing stations, stabilizing, preparing for transport. Field and evacuation hospitals, surgery, shock treatment, post-op holding. Then farther, hospitals near the beaches, hospital ships, transport aircraft, general hospitals in England, and eventually long recovery. The system exists so that the forward hospital does not become a graveyard. But the system is only as strong as its weakest vehicle. On an afternoon when the sun finally breaks through the clouds, Eleanor is assigned to evacuation staging. A line of litters lies under a tarp, tags tied firmly, dressings secured, IVs clamped for transport. The men are quieter here. They have passed through the worst hour. Now they wait for the next movement, the next handoff. A driver from an ambulance company wipes sweat from his brow with a muddy sleeve. "We're taking them to the beach," he says, "if the road holds." The road seldom holds. Traffic jams, bomb craters, broken bridges, German artillery that still reaches farther than comfort. Yet the ambulances run anyway because delay turns manageable injuries into fatalities. Eleanor checks each man before loading. She reads tags like a sacred text. Diagnosis, treatment, morphine time, plasma or blood given, allergies if known. She tightens a blanket around a corporal, shivering despite the heat. "You're going to a bigger hospital," she tells him. He blinks. "France? Maybe England," Eleanor says, "wherever the system puts you." The word system sounds strange in her mouth because it feels too clean for what she's seen, but it is accurate. A WWII clerk beside her, pressed into casualty tracking, marks names on a manifest list. "Ma'am," the clerk says quietly, "how do you remember all of them?" Eleanor doesn't. She remembers tags, times and faces in flashes. The rest is paperwork, because paperwork is what prevents a man from disappearing. I don't remember, Eleanor says. I record. As the ambulances pull out, Eleanor hears aircraft overhead again. Not bombers this time. Transport planes moving in steady lines. Medical evacuation by air has become more common, and the staff talks about it with a kind of reverence. The sky is faster than the road. The sky bypasses the hedgerows. Later that evening, Eleanor meets a flight nurse passing through the hospital area, her uniform neat despite the mud, her posture taut with fatigue held in check. "From the airfield?" Eleanor asks. The flight nurse nods. "We're taking stabilized cases back. They load them fast. We don't get much time to check tags." Eleanor gestures at the stack of records on her table. "Then I'll make them readable," she says. They stand together for a brief moment, two nurses in different parts of the same chain, connected by ink and tubing. The flight nurse's eyes flick toward the shock ward. "Is it still bad?" she asks. Eleanor thinks of Cobra, of the nightlights went down, of blood containers and trembling hands. "It's still war," Eleanor answers. The flight nurse gives a short laugh without humour. "That's what I tell myself too." A messenger interrupts with another instruction. "Move supplies forward, prepare to jump. More casualties expected as the front breaks out beyond St. Lo." The breakout means hope for soldiers. It means acceleration for the medical pipeline. More movement, more uncertainty, more stress on the cold chain, on fuel, on tents, on people. That night, Eleanor returns to shock ward and finds a man awake, staring at the tent roof. "You a nurse?" he asks. "Yes," Eleanor answers, adjusting his drip. He swallows. "I saw them load me on 3 different trucks. Thought I was cargo." Eleanor pauses, then answers carefully, because the truth can be delivered without cruelty. "You're not cargo," she says, "but you are moving through a system that has to keep you alive fast." He nods slowly. "Fast," he repeats, as if tasting the word. Eleanor checks his pulse again. Stronger now. She writes the time on his tag. Fast is not a preference. It is an invention forced by the Normandy surge. It is triage and throughput and blood logistics and air evacuation and nurses who don't stop moving because stopping would mean the system breaks. Outside, a truck backfires and several men flinch. Eleanor doesn't. She has learned which sounds matter most. The change in a patient's breathing, the pause in a drip, the shouted word incoming. The hospital will move again soon. For now, it holds. And holding is victory in inches. The leap forward, packing a hospital like a weapon. The order to move arrives like an insult. Not because it is wrong, Eleanor understands why, but because it comes when the staff is already stripped to the bone. A major stands near HQ with a map spread on the hood of a jeep. Mud spatters the paper. His finger traces a line south and west. "We're displacing," he says. "Elements forward. Keep a rear detachment running. We can't shut down. We'll do it in phases." Phases. Another word that means improvise without failure. Eleanor is assigned to the rear detachment for the first phase. That means she will keep shock and post-op operating while other tents are struck and loaded. It is the medical equivalent of changing a tire while the truck is rolling. The operating tent continues, though reduced. 1 table instead of 2. Fewer surgeons, fewer nurses. The attached surgical teams are reassigned forward. Eleanor watches them pack. Instruments wrapped, counted, stowed. Sterilizers drained. Blood containers secured, ice replenished. A corporal checks a list twice, then a 3rd time. "You lose 1 clamp," he mutters, "and the next place we set up, you'll wish you hadn't." Eleanor knows he's right. Ambulances still arrive. Even during a move, the war does not schedule casualties around logistics. The triage officer adapts immediately, more emphasis on stabilization and evacuation, less on holding. The rear detachment becomes a funnel pushing men onward as quickly as possible. Then the new complication arrives, civilians and prisoners. A French farmer is brought in with a leg injury from debris. His face is grey with shock, eyes fixed on Eleanor's brassard as if it is both hope and foreign occupation. Behind him, 2 German prisoners, guarded by MPs, are brought in with injuries that cannot wait. The first time Eleanor sees enemy uniforms inside her medical lane, she feels a hard, instinctive resistance. Not hatred, something colder, the reflex of us and them. The senior physician does not allow hesitation. "Treat by severity," he says, voice flat. "That's the rule." Eleanor applies the rule because it is the only thing that keeps the hospital from collapsing into revenge. She hangs plasma for the farmer, then checks a German prisoner's tag for morphine time. The prisoner's eyes avoid hers. He is not brave, he is simply injured, and injury is a universal language. Outside, an MP lights a cigarette and watches with a face that suggests he would prefer the rule to be different. He says nothing. The system requires silence on that point. As trucks load out, the hospital's tent city shrinks. Empty patches of flattened grass appear where wards were minutes ago. The sight is unsettling, a reminder that this place was never a place at all. It was a function. Eleanor's shock ward, reduced and tight, holds only the most unstable. The goal is to package them for movement without tipping them over the edge. She tightens dressings, secures tags, clamps lines, wraps men in blankets like parcels. A patient, a young sergeant, grasps her wrist. "Are we moving again?" he asks. "Yes," Eleanor answers. "Will I make it?" Eleanor could offer comfort without truth. She chooses truth shaped into usefulness. "Keep breathing," she says. "Stay awake if you can. We'll keep you warm." The sergeant swallows and nods, obeying, because obedience is sometimes all a wounded man can give. Late in the day, the forward detachment radios back for supplies and staff. The rear detachment's time is ending. Eleanor is told to pack her kit. She looks around her shock ward. Canvas walls, stained with months of work, cots bearing the weight of men who passed through and moved on. She realizes she has begun to think of it as hers. But it is not hers. It is the army's moving machine. She rolls bandages, checks her medical bag, secures her helmet strap. Outside, a truck waits, engine running. As she climbs into the back with other nurses and medics, she hears artillery again. Closer now, because the front has moved and the hospital is following. The truck jolts forward. Eleanor grips the side rail and watches the old site disappear behind hedgerows. Ahead is new ground, new mud, new tents. The same surge, reshaped. And the invention of speed medicine will be required all over again. August pursuit, training while running. Mid-August 1944, south of the St. Lo ruins, Normandy. The landscape changes as they push beyond the worst of the hedgerow choke points. Roads widen in places, then narrow again. Villages appear with shattered roofs and empty windows. The smell of smoke fades, returns, fades again. The hospital sets up on new ground. Fields that look almost peaceful until you see the tire ruts and the slit trenches and the Red Cross flags snapping in the wind. Eleanor is now a veteran of this system. The surge has not ended, but its shape is different. Fewer concentrated mass casualty days like Cobra, more steady flow as units advance quickly and pockets of resistance flare. The staff is still tired. In some ways, more tired, because momentum does not allow recovery. New nurses arrive, replacements, eyes wide, uniforms still too clean. Eleanor sees herself in them from June and feels a strange impatience. Not because they are weak, because the system cannot afford their learning curve. The head nurse assigns Eleanor a task that sounds simple and is anything but. Train 2 new nurses for shock and pre-op in 48 hours. Eleanor brings them into shock ward and points not at equipment first, but at process. Tags are life, she says. If you lose the time, you lose the patient. If you hang a drip and don't write it down, the next nurse will make a mistake. Mistakes here aren't paperwork, they're graves. One of the new nurses, a second lieutenant with freckles and a trembling jaw, nods too hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Not ma'am," Eleanor corrects automatically. "Lieutenant, we're officers. Act like it." The new nurse blinks. "Yes, Lieutenant." Eleanor shows them how to read the field medical tag, where to look for morphine time, how to check for signs of shock without needing a machine, skin temperature, pulse quality, breathing pattern, mental status. She teaches them how to warm without overheating, how to start plasma without rushing air into the line, how to secure tubing so movement doesn't rip it free. She teaches them the hard thing, how to be calm when a man begs. "You can't promise," Eleanor says quietly. "You can reassure without lying. You can give them the next step. People survive on next steps." The new nurses watch as an ambulance arrives with a cluster of casualties from a sudden firefight near a village crossroads. The triage officer calls for immediate surgery cases. Eleanor's pre-op station snaps into motion. She assigns tasks like an engineer assigns load. You start IV on cot 2. You prep cot 3, clip and scrub. Medic, get blood ready, labelled and cold. "Clerk, right times," repeat them back to me. The new nurses move, clumsy at first, then faster, then almost coordinated. The system absorbs them. That night, Eleanor catches a moment by the supply tent where a physician is arguing with a quartermaster officer. "We need more penicillin forward," the physician insists. The quartermaster spreads his hands. We get what we get. Eleanor watches and feels the old frustration. The war is fought not only with rifles but with shipping schedules. In post-op, she checks a man whose surgery ended hours ago. His pulse is stable, his breathing steady. He looks at her with tired eyes. "Where do I go now?" he asks. Eleanor looks at the evacuation board. "You'll go back," she says, "further than us, somewhere with walls." He smiles faintly. "Walls," he repeats as if it's luxury. Outside, transport aircraft rumble overhead, heading toward airstrips that now sit closer to the front than before. The evacuation chain has tightened. Throughput has improved. In some ways, the invention is working. But there is always a cost. Eleanor sees it in the staff's faces, in hands that shake when they finally stop moving, in tempers that flare over small mistakes because the margin for error is gone. The chaplain finds her again with coffee. "Still functioning?" he asks. Eleanor takes the cup. "Still here," she answers. The chaplain nods toward the new nurses. "You're teaching them." Eleanor watches them adjust a drip and secure a tag, their movements now more sure. "They'll have to be," she says. In Normandy, the system survives by replication. Skills passed forward as fast as the wounded are moved backward. The hospital will move again soon. It always does. But for this moment, under canvas and sky, Eleanor watches a new nurse speak calmly to a frightened patient. And she knows that the invention of speed surgery is not only instruments and tables. It is people learning to become precise under pressure, because the surge demands it. And the surge is not finished. After St. Lo, what the system saved. Late August 1944, Normandy, France. The road south of St. Lo is lined with evidence that the war has accelerated. Burned-out vehicles, broken bridges replaced with temporary spans, columns of troops moving with the confidence of momentum, civilians returning cautiously to ruined villages as if walking into a dream that might still explode. Eleanor's hospital has jumped forward again and again, each set up faster than the last. The canvas goes up in practiced motion, stakes hammered, cots unfolded, sterilizers fired, blood containers placed in shade, guarded, accounted for. The machine rebuilds itself like a reflex. But something in Eleanor has shifted. Not sentimentality, not despair. Something quieter, the recognition of what has been built here, an entire doctrine of survival forced by necessity. She sees it in the way triage is now immediate and standardized, tags always present, times always recorded. She sees it in the operating tent's rhythm, pre-op feeding the tables, post-op clearing quickly, attached teams arriving when needed. She sees it in shock ward practice, warmth, plasma and blood used with deliberate priority, the cold chain treated like a weapon system. She sees it in evacuation staging, patients packaged for movement as soon as they can tolerate it, because throughput is not a slogan. It is the difference between a tent city that collapses and one that endures. On a warm afternoon, Eleanor steps outside shock ward and looks toward the horizon. The guns are still audible, but farther now. The sense of being pinned in place has loosened. A truck arrives with mail, rare enough that men gather as if it's a holiday. Eleanor receives a letter from home with familiar handwriting, the paper smelling faintly of a world that still has clean rooms and steady electricity. She does not open it immediately. Instead, she watches an ambulance pull up with a single patient, an injured driver brought in from a road accident, not enemy fire. The war's hazards are not limited to bullets. Eleanor helps unload, reads the tag, checks the time, assigns him to a cot. The new nurses, no longer new, begin their work smoothly, without waiting for orders. Eleanor feels a moment of pride she does not indulge for long. Pride is also a luxury, but she allows herself the recognition. They can do it now. In the evening, the head nurse calls Eleanor to a short staff meeting. It is not ceremonial, it is practical. "We've been commended for throughput," the head nurse says. "Higher command wants our procedures written down. How we staged pre-op, how we managed shock, how we kept tags and times. We're going to formalize it." Eleanor listens and realizes the invention is becoming doctrine, written, replicated, exported to other units. What was forced under canvas in Normandy will shape how they do medicine elsewhere. After the meeting, Eleanor finally opens the letter from home. It is ordinary. News of a sister's wedding, a neighbour's garden, a father's new job. Words from a world that seems impossibly far away. She reads it twice, then folds it carefully. Later, in shock ward, she sits beside a patient whose pulse she has checked 3 times in the last hour. He looks older than her, but not old, eyes tracking her face. "You the one that kept me alive?" he asks, voice weak. Eleanor could answer with modesty. She could answer with deflection. Instead, she answers with the truth as she understands it now. "A lot of people kept you alive," she says. "Medics on the line, ambulance drivers, doctors, nurses, the whole chain." He swallows. "Chain," he repeats. Then, "Thank you." Eleanor nods once, because emotion is dangerous when you still have work to do. Outside, the night is quieter than it used to be. Not silent, never silent, but quieter. The generator hum feels almost normal. The canvas walls flutter gently in a warm breeze. Eleanor walks to the edge of the tent line and looks up at the sky. She thinks of the bombers over Cobra, of the transport aircraft carrying wounded away, of the blood shipments kept cold against all odds. She thinks of the pace that was invented because there was no other choice. Speed surgery, speed triage, speed evacuation. A system built in mud, refined in crisis, held together by discipline and tags and times and hands that refused to stop moving. Eleanor returns to her ward. She checks the drips again. She writes down the time. The war will continue beyond Normandy. The hospital will move again. But the invention made here, this hard, precise speed, will move with them. And tonight, for the first time since June, Eleanor allows herself a single quiet thought before she turns back to work. We did not stop the surge, but we learned how to live inside it.